Good afternoon. Welcome to the first session in the MCIE and Brooks Publishing Inclusive Early Childhood Education Online Training Series. Thank you all for joining us. I'm Barb Gruber from MCIE, and I will be your facilitator for this session. During the session, you'll be muted, and you can type questions in the chat window, and they will be answered as they come up or at the end of the session. I just want to remind you that by joining us today, you will hear this live session and have an opportunity to ask those questions using the chat window. You will also be receiving a copy of the presenter's book, a certificate of attendance, and the link for the recording of today's session. And for today's session, you'll also receive a link for an online evaluation using SurveyMonkey. Today's session is First Steps to Preschool Inclusion, How to Jumpstart Your Program-Wide Plan with Dr. Sarika Gupta. Dr. Gupta is an assistant professor and program coordinator with the Center for Technology and Education in Johns Hopkins University School of Education. Her work focuses on data-driven decision-making in early childhood special education with a focus on improving preschool inclusion. It is my pleasure to turn the session over to you, Sari. And let me put your presentation up.
Thank you.
All right, here we go.
Thank you, Barb Gruber. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining First Steps to Preschool Inclusion. My name is Sarika Gupta, and I'm an assistant professor and program coordinator of early childhood education at the Center for Technology and Education at Johns Hopkins University. Just before we begin, I'd like to thank the Maryland Coalition for Inclusive Education and Brooks Publishing for inviting me to present in this exciting webinar series with a number of respected experts on inclusive early childhood education. Okay, so are you interested in preschool inclusion but unsure where to start? Are you curious about what preschool inclusion looks like and whether it really works? Are you wondering how to make inclusion work in your program or for your child? These questions are the focus of today's webinar. My hope is that you will leave this webinar with an understanding of preschool inclusion, steps to prepare for preschool inclusion, and suggestions to promote preschool inclusion in an early childhood program and in your community. Understanding inclusion and preparing for inclusion are two ways to ensure its success. Today, I'll be sharing information that will strengthen your understanding of inclusion and those ingredients needed to make it work, such as a ready environment and a team approach. Additional suggestions to support preschool inclusion will also be provided. So in other words, I'll be talking about the critical first steps you can take toward becoming an informed consumer and advocate for preschool inclusion. So let's pause for just a moment to learn more about you. Rather than do a poll, I think it would, given how many attendees we have, I think that we can just indicate what your primary role is. So if you could just take a moment to type in the chat box which of these is your primary role. So are you a parent or a family member? Are you a teacher? Are you a director or administrator, a professional development or technical assistance provider, a researcher, a university faculty member, or a policymaker? So I'll pause here for a minute so that we can just take a quick look at what our participants' roles are. Oh, fantastic. So several TA providers. We have a nice range of folks joining us. Fantastic. Great. So later in the session, we'll be talking about the audience for this book too, and it sounds like we've got the folks that will be able to use these materials with the folks that they're working with. So whether you're working with teachers and families, this is a good mix of folks. Fantastic. Okay, so let's continue and let's get started. We'll begin with an understanding of preschool inclusion. To become an informed consumer of preschool inclusion, it's important to understand what we mean by inclusion. So in this section, I will review the definition of inclusion and what inclusion looks like. Then I'll describe several federal policies that support the inclusion of preschoolers with disabilities across early care and learning programs and conclude this section with a summary of what we know about inclusion from the research. A definition of early childhood inclusion was developed jointly by the Division of Early Childhood of the Council for Exceptional Children and the National Association for the Education of Young Children in 2009. These two professional organizations serve as the voice of families and practitioners in early intervention, early childhood special education, and early childhood broadly. Early childhood inclusion embodies the values, policies, and practices that support the right of every infant and young child and his or her family, regardless of ability, to participate in a broad range of activities and contacts as full members of families, communities, and society. The desired results of inclusive experiences for children with and without disabilities and their families include a sense of belonging and membership, positive social relationships and friendships, and development and learning to reach their full potential. The defining features of inclusion that can be used to identify high-quality early childhood programs and services are access, participation, and supports. This definition is informed by policy, research, and professional and family wisdom, and it promotes a philosophy and approach to how we should be educating all of our young children. In doing this, we can help children individually and collectively experience positive outcomes that last into adolescence and adulthood. A few points to note in this definition. First, notice that the inclusion of children without disabilities is addressed along with the inclusion of children with disabilities. Traditionally, we think of inclusion as disability specific. Here, DEC and NAEYC remind us that we should maintain high expectations for all children and that all children and their families benefit from the sense of belonging and membership that inclusion promotes. Also note, I'm getting ahead of myself here. Also note that there's no mention of a specific place. This is because inclusion is an approach to supporting young children's learning and development. What I like about this definition is that it echoes the sentiment in a federal policy developed decades ago that guides the inclusion of young children with disabilities specifically. That federal policy is called the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act of 2004, or IDEA. The first line in IDEA states that Congress finds the following: disability is a natural part of the human experience and in no way diminishes the right of individuals to participate in or contribute to society. Improving educational results for children with disability is an essential element of our national policy of ensuring equality of opportunity, full participation, independent living, and economic self-sufficiency for individuals with disabilities. This law, which was initially passed as the Education for All Handicapped Children Act of 1975, or PL 94-142, has been promoting the inclusion of children with disabilities for over 35 years. The law also acknowledges the wealth of evidence that supports children with disabilities' academic achievement and functional performance. It provides concrete ways in which we can more effectively educate children with disabilities. One way is to have high expectations for children's learning and development with their peers in regular settings. Additional ways include engaging parents in educational decision-making for their children, collaborating with others within and across programs to ensure children are meaningfully included rather than simply placed in a setting, providing children with appropriate special education and related services, aids, and supports in the regular classroom to facilitate these meaningful experiences, and finally, in taking the time to prepare professionals with the skills and knowledge needed to promote learning. A provision in IDEA called the Least Restrictive Environment, or LRE, specifically supports the inclusion of children with disabilities in regular early childhood settings and with their peers. The provision states that each public agency must ensure that to the maximum extent appropriate, children with disabilities, including children in public or private institutions or other care families, are educated with children who are non-disabled, and special classes, separate schooling, or the removal of children with disabilities from the regular educational environment occurs only if the nature or severity of the disability is such that education in regular classes with the use of supplementary aids and services cannot be achieved satisfactorily. So the presumption here is that the most appropriate placement for a child is his or her regular educational setting, unless otherwise determined by the child's Individualized Education Program, or IEP team, which includes the child's parents. In fact, there's a place on the IEP where teams must include a justification for a more restrictive environment than the child's regular educational setting. Several additional federal policies also support the inclusion of preschoolers with disabilities, including the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and the Improving Head Start for School Readiness Act of 2007. The Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, or ADA, is an anti-discrimination law that protects individuals with disabilities against discrimination and promotes equal opportunity. The ADA supports inclusion in early childhood settings by encouraging the use of accommodations for children with disabilities to participate in all aspects of a program. So this can mean ensuring physical access for a child in a wheelchair by building a ramp. It can also mean providing aids and services to a child so that she can participate in program activities, such as morning meeting. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 preceded the ADA and was also developed to prevent discrimination of individuals with disabilities in programs that receive federal assistance. Specifically, individuals, even preschoolers with disabilities, cannot be excluded or denied access to any program or activity supported by federal funding. This means that early learning programs cannot deny children with disabilities the opportunity to participate, nor can they provide lower quality, less effective services to children with disabilities. Head Start is a federal program that promotes school readiness for young children in low-income families by providing educational and other services. Since its inception in the 1960s, the Act has supported the inclusion of children with disabilities in its programs. Reauthorized in 2007 as the Improving Head Start for School Readiness Act, this now includes a focus on promoting children's cognitive, social, and emotional development. The law still maintains that at least 10% of children enrolled in each Head Start program should be children with identified disabilities. Head Start programs must also engage in outreach and recruitment efforts to actively locate and recruit children with disabilities and may not deny children a placement based on a disability or its severity, even when staff seem unsure or apprehensive about disabilities. So let's pause here for a moment to learn about the type of preschool program with which you primarily work. And for those of you who are TA providers, this might mean the type of preschool program that your professionals, the professionals that you're working with, are primarily employed in. So again, if we could just take a moment to type in the chat box the type of preschool program you primarily work with or in. This will kind of give us a sense. Okay, we've got center-based preschool childcare, County Board of Education program, which sounds perhaps like a publicly funded program. Head Start, great. State-funded pre-K, okay, good. We've got several people from there. Maryland Excels, public center-based. Okay, so we've got quite a few publicly funded programs or representatives of publicly funded programs. Great. So much of what we've been talking about so far is relevant to what we're talking about today. I'm also going to pause right here for a moment to just make sure. I've been going so fast, I forgot to ask whether you all can hear me clearly. If you could all just indicate again in the chat box whether you can hear me clearly, that would be great. Fantastic. Thank you. And is the pacing sounding good for everyone as well? A yes or no would be great. Fantastic. Okay, let's keep going. So, one of the reasons why I asked you about where you're working or where the professionals you are working with are working is because regardless of where you work and where they work, the aim of inclusion is the same. So on this slide, you'll see 4 circles arranged in 2 rows. In each circle are green dots that represent typically developing children. There are also red, yellow, and blue dots that represent children with disabilities, delays, or other individual needs such as challenging behaviors, at-risk factors, children who speak English as a second language, or children with specific health needs. The bottom row includes 3 circles. In the circle on the left, only typically developing children are being educated in the regular setting. Children with individual needs are not seen in the setting at all, nor are they necessarily being educated together, so they are completely isolated from their typical peers and each other. This first circle represents exclusion. In the second circle in the bottom row, we see an example of segregation. Again, typically developing children are being educated together, but children with individual needs are not seen in the setting. They are, however, together, though in a separate setting that has no interaction with the regular setting. In the third circle, children with disabilities might be seen in the regular setting, though they remain together and any interaction with typically developing peers may be minimal. This is referred to as integration. Inclusion, in the top circle, presumes that all children are educated in the same setting with their typically developing peers. In addition to being physically included then, children with disabilities, and really any child with special needs, should be participating in the setting's daily routines and in meaningful ways with peers and adults so that they are active, contributing members of their environment. This circle at the top should guide your everyday approach with children. Inclusion is our starting place, our aim, and our beginning expectation for all young children. So how do we achieve inclusion represented in that top circle? By focusing on 3 features that characterize high-quality early childhood inclusion: access, participation, and supports. By access, we mean providing children with access to a wide range of learning opportunities, activities, settings, and environments. We also want to ensure that children are meaningfully engaged in everyday routines with their peers and the adults wherever they spend time. We could ask whether adults are providing children with individualized accommodations and supports that enable them to then participate fully in play and learning activities with their peers and adults in the classroom. Both access and participation depend on a third feature, supports, which describe an infrastructure of system-level supports that facilitate the efforts of teachers and specialists to provide inclusive services such as collaborative planning time, access to ongoing professional development, or coordinated services. So let's dig a little deeper into these features. For each feature, you'll see a list of questions that may help you identify these components in an early childhood setting. When we ask questions about the range of learning opportunities, activities, settings, and environments available to children, we are looking at whether the program is accessible. Another way to determine this is to look for examples of multiple and varied forms of learning and instruction that are provided to all children. Participation as the second feature may seem straightforward to recognize, but it's really the quality of participation that is important. So in other words, it's not enough that children are physically placed in a regular setting or sitting at morning meeting. It's more important whether children with disabilities are provided individualized accommodations and supports to participate fully in morning meetings with their peers and the adults. So here's an example. A 4-year-old child with a visual impairment may not be able to visually read the message at morning meeting, but the teacher or a peer reads it aloud so that she can listen and answer any questions that may be asked. This is also an example of how adults can promote all children's meaningful participation during the morning meeting. Now, let's say that the children are studying shapes. The morning message asks the children to search in pairs for 2 objects with specific characteristics in the room, such as curved edges, and then to come back to meeting with the 2 objects so that they can describe them verbally to their peers. The child with a visual impairment may not feel comfortable navigating the room, though this is something that she has been working on independently and with the help of verbal prompts from the teacher. The teacher uses prepositions such as next to or underneath to help the child move within centers to find items, thereby scaffolding the child's language and spatial development. The teacher reminds the child's peer to use similar language to help her friend find objects. Then when the pairs return to morning meeting, the teacher asks this pair in particular to describe where in each center they found these objects, further reinforcing their teamwork in finding the items. Not only is this teacher promoting both children's social-emotional development and positive collaboration, she is also demonstrating her understanding of using individualized supports. The third feature, supports, encompasses the larger system of supports that equip teachers with opportunities to learn how to individualize appropriately, so that children are given multiple ways to learn. When administrators support teacher efforts to ensure access and participation, perhaps through policies, training, or simply planning time, they are conveying their commitment to inclusion through an investment in their teachers and staff. Okay, so here we have a vignette that's also available within the book. And I'm also going to, let's take a moment here to apply what we've just learned about the key features of inclusion. So I'm going to read it aloud. For those of you with a copy of First Steps to Preschool Inclusion, you can follow along in Chapter 1 on page 7. And what I'd like you to think about as I'm reading this is whether you can identify which feature needs attention in this vignette: access, participation, or support. Okay, so here goes. Miss Ovia is in her 7th year of teaching preschool at the local temple. This year, her director asked her to join the Inclusion Task Force, a small group of select teachers, parents, and leaders charged with creating a vision for inclusion in the temple. Task Force teacher members thought the best way to develop a vision was to survey staff to determine their understanding of inclusion and what might impede inclusive efforts. One teacher Ms. Ovia spoke to suggested that children with disabilities be directed to specific classrooms. When asked why, this teacher explained that she did not have the expertise or the time to learn how to include children with disabilities and thought that they would be better served by being placed in a class with a teacher with specialized knowledge of disabilities and individualized instruction. Ms. Ovia considered this teacher's suggestion. She thought the teacher made a valid point. Children are served better when teachers know how to support their individual needs. She wondered, would the practice of directing children into specific classrooms negate the program's vision for inclusion? Also, should only the teachers with specialized experience be expected to include children with disabilities, or should a teacher's lack of knowledge and experience be justification enough to place children in classrooms in which they would have more potential to develop and learn? If the temple was instituting a program-wide vision for inclusion, would each classroom need to be prepared to include children with disabilities? So again, take a moment to think. I'll go back to the vignette in just a second, but take a moment to think about which feature of high-quality early childhood inclusion Ms. Ovia could focus on to help this teacher feel more supported and more capable of including children with disabilities in her classroom. Should she focus on access? Should she focus on participation? Should she focus on support? If everyone could just type their response into the chat box, that would be great. And I'll go back to the vignette too, so that looks like we've got a few responses coming in. So far, all of the responses seem to be on the same page. Wait for another moment for other folks to respond and think about which feature of inclusion she might want to begin with. Great, we have a rationale for one of our features as well. So far, we've got several responses. Several folks have suggested that supports are the place to start. One of our participants suggested that the teacher needs to have additional training and support for the administration to increase her understanding and to be better prepared to meet a student's needs. Supports and understanding, great. Does anyone think that Ms. Ovia should begin with a different feature of inclusion, and if so, why? I'll wait for just a few more seconds just to make sure everyone has an opportunity to respond. So we have another response. I'm going to scroll back up here to see. So another participant has said that they agree it's about supports, but it also impacts access, because if some teachers are allowed to opt out, students who belong in that setting won't be able to participate. So yes, there is some crossover and overlap between the three features, and that's exactly what we're getting at. The teacher notes her lack of knowledge about individualized instruction. So perhaps with the right support, so whether it's some professional development, some shared planning time, just a basic understanding about inclusion, she might be feeling more comfortable with being able to include this child, and she might learn from her peers or colleagues who are more experienced how she can individualize instructions in effective ways. We emphasize inclusion through these three features because it leads to positive outcomes in young children. Over 30 years of research tell us that inclusion benefits children with and without disabilities, and that generally, families view inclusion favorably. Several studies suggest that children with disabilities who are included with their typical peers show more positive social and emotional behaviors than children with disabilities who aren't in the company of their typically developing peers. In many cases, children with disabilities are learning through imitation. In turn, typically developing children learn to recognize individuals grow and learn in different ways, an understanding and sensitivity that stays with them into adulthood. We also know from the research that supports matter. Policies such as federal or program standards, support from key personnel such as administrators or leaders, can positively influence the acceptance and implementation of inclusion. So going back to our vignette, this is the piece that might have helped the teacher that Ms. Ovia spoke with feel more comfortable with including children in her classroom. As a result, teachers and specialists may be more open or feel more open to implementing inclusion when they know that they will be given opportunities to work and learn together. The other important piece to note is that collaboration is needed. Finally, we have learned that inclusion can look different across settings, that universal access to inclusive programs is needed, and that specialized instruction helps children achieve individual outcomes. Let's think about the need for access to universal programs for a moment. So this slide shows us how many children with disabilities that are eligible for services under IDEA's Part B, Section 619, Preschool Special Education Program, were served from 2004 to 2011. So as you can see, the number of preschool children being served has been steadily increasing. In 2004, just over 700,000 children ages 3 to 5 with disabilities were being served, and about 7 years later, closer to 750,000 children were being served. So the steady rise seems noteworthy until we look at these numbers as a percentage of the total population of children in the U.S. When we look at the data this way, we can see that the percentage of children being served really hasn't increased that much. And while there may be a number of reasons for this that fall outside the scope of this webinar, it's important to note that these numbers do not capture those children who are not eligible for preschool special education services, yet have individualized needs that are influencing or in some cases impeding their development and learning. So which children am I referring to? I mean children with challenging behaviors, children who speak English as a second language, or children just simply needing a boost. Again, all of whom may not qualify for preschool special education services under IDEA. They're just not reflected here. Those of us working in the field know anecdotally that the numbers of these children and teachers' desires for training to support these fast-growing groups of children is on the rise. So I included these data here to just remind you that while we can focus on including children with identified disabilities, it's also important to think more broadly about including children with those individualized needs that really just don't qualify for specialized services. Again, this gets back to inclusion being our philosophy and approach to early childhood, So here's a bit more information about what we know about preschool special education in the U.S. States are required to report to the U.S. Office of Special Education Programs where eligible children with disabilities are being served. In regular early childhood programs, which include a majority of children without disabilities, in a separate class that includes less children with disabilities, with service providers, or in other locations. So when we look closer at those regular early childhood programs, we can see the types of programs children with disabilities are attending. state-funded pre-K programs, Title I programs, Head Start programs, locally funded programs, and early reading programs. And it sounds like some of our participants are from the range of programs represented here. Why I pulled this up is because when we know where children are being served, we know where we can provide more support. Still, a number of children spend time in separate environments rather than regular early childhood programs. So why is this happening? Remember earlier in the webinar when we talked about LRE and the most appropriate placement for a child is his or her regular educational setting unless otherwise determined by the child's IEP team? If the team, which includes the child's parents, decides that a child needs a more restrictive setting to address more intensive needs, that's okay. And that's what the LRE provision allows for. This is why inclusion doesn't mean a place. It refers to a continuum of settings that are available for children depending on their needs. What we don't want to do is begin with the separate setting, or the yellow box on the right, and exclude children from their peers from the outset. We want to begin with high expectations for children, keeping in mind that they are often learning from their peers. We can move across the continuum to consider more restrictive settings in the green and yellow boxes if the child needs more support. But remember that the more restrictive placement must be agreed on by the child's IEP team, and the reason for why the child will not be fully included must be noted on the IEP. So what we begin to see then is that there is some ambiguity that can potentially lead to confusion and some issues around inclusion. So the first issue is around that continuum that we just talked about. Certainly, we want to make high expectations for all young children, believing in their potential to make gains that we intentionally scaffold. However, we must balance our desires for children to excel with where we know children will be supported appropriately and with instructional practices known to work. The continuum really allows for thoughtful decision-making, but teams and parents may incorrectly use it as a map to choose what is most familiar, convenient, or easiest. When placement decisions are made this way, it's problematic. Strong knowledge about the definition of inclusion, the continuum, and the laws that guide inclusion are critical, and that's why we've spent a lot of time on today's webinar reviewing them. The second issue is around the settings available to children. We all know we need more high-quality preschool classrooms, and many recent federal efforts have focused on expanding preschool education. Simply having settings, though, is not enough. It's important that early care and learning programs hire and continually support staff understanding of typical child development, assessment, evidence-based practice, and how to deliver instruction so children make gains. This leads to our third issue. Teachers and providers may not feel they have the skills and knowledge just described, and as a result may resist inclusion, sort of like the teacher who was speaking to Ms. Ovia in our vignette that we visited earlier. Of course, this makes sense. Several studies have found that attitudes are a barrier to inclusion. When teachers are asked why they don't feel comfortable including children with disabilities, they report a lack of preparation around inclusion, around disabilities, and specialized instruction. They may also not understand the benefits of inclusion for all young children. If staff and teachers aren't knowledgeable or able to articulate the aims and benefits of inclusion, parents of children with and without disabilities may doubt the value of inclusion, particularly when they see that teachers aren't open to or prepared to implement it. Teacher and parent uncertainty about inclusion can stem from a lack of broad support for inclusion, which administrators can provide. This means that administrators really play a key role in promoting inclusion. At this time, we know very little about the early childhood administrators across this country and as a demographic. What we do know is that the characteristics of this group vary. Some are prepared as leaders, others move into leadership positions because of seniority. Some administrators have content knowledge of early childhood but not of special education, or vice versa. Others may have a business background and may choose to focus on program operation rather than content or instruction. And in fact, a recent survey of preschool directors that was led by Sharon Ryan in New Jersey confirmed the need for specialized knowledge of inclusion and children with special needs. I suspect that many more administrators feel the same. Again, this is okay. This is a starting point. So for all of these reasons, it's important to prepare for preschool inclusion in a thoughtful, intentional, and systematic way. So one way to do this is to use our book, First Steps to Preschool Inclusion. My colleagues Bill Henniger and Megan Vinn and I recognize the need for explicit guidance on what inclusion is, what it entails, and tips to ensure a successful startup effort. We organize the book by two sections: Inclusion Policy and Research, and Critical Considerations for Inclusion. So the first section really provides readers with the foundational knowledge to understand the what, the when, the why, and the how we include children with disabilities. The second section prepares individuals to systematically think about the quality of their programs and the collaborative work needed to implement inclusion. In this webinar, we've really focused on that first section. What will be important to remember as you think more about inclusion and as you work with your professionals is that it really depends on a team effort. It's not enough for programs to say they want to include children with disabilities. They will need to take a closer look at the quality of their programs and any specific requirements for inclusion that their programs may have. These two topics are covered in Chapters 4 and 5. Chapter 6 describes the process and a timeline to introduce and build support for inclusion. And finally, in Chapter 7, we describe commonly reported challenges and offer a start list of strategies and solutions you might find helpful. We wrote this book for administrators, leaders, and aspiring leaders. Here's how we define those groups. So, administrators we describe as being in the business of operating a school system, a district, or a program. So they might include individuals like preschool through 12 superintendents, elementary school principals, or directors of a child care center. Early childhood leaders, by contrast, are professionals who coordinate inclusion efforts or serve as consultants to school systems, districts, or programs. So these individuals may include seasoned teachers, professional development or technical assistance providers, many of whom are on this call, or university professors. And then we have aspiring leaders. And really what we mean by that is individuals who are enrolled in administrator or teacher licensure programs, teacher preparation programs, and or state leadership academies. This group also includes individuals who are just interested in strengthening their understanding of inclusion to improve their practice. Interestingly, we're also receiving feedback that family members are finding this book to be a useful resource in understanding sort of the ABCs of preschool inclusion. So since leaders are often asked to teach others about inclusion, my colleagues and I thought it might be helpful to describe how to use this book for professional development workshops, undergraduate and graduate courses, or leadership academies. So quickly, I'll run through each chapter and the guiding questions. We also developed an activity sequence that aligns with these chapters. I won't be talking about that here today, but if you're interested in the accompanying activity sequence, please feel free to email me, and I'm happy to share it with you. You might find that the overall sequence of the book is helpful, or you might find that the content within a specific chapter might be useful in addressing challenges that you're seeing. So let's take a closer look at each one of these chapters. I talked today about much of what's covered in Chapter 1. The guiding questions in the arrow to the right of the red box might sound familiar. So what does inclusion look like? What is the continuum? What does the inclusion position statement say and promote? We talked about the 3 features of inclusion, the overall expectations, and what's really needed for inclusion to work. We build on this foundation in Chapter 2 by describing the federal policies and laws governing inclusion. So some of what we talked about today, such as IDEA and the specific LRE provision that supports the inclusion of children with disabilities, we touched on. We also reviewed the Americans with Disabilities Act, Section 504, and the Head Start Act, all of which promote inclusion in early care and learning programs. What's important to note when you're in your work with your professionals is that these laws really provide a framework for our definition of inclusion in early childhood in our day-to-day practice. So it's important to spend some time focusing on these pieces. In Chapter 3, we dive into the research, taking a look at how inclusion benefits children with and without disabilities in both the short and the long term. We end the chapter with a discussion of evidence-based practice. And what we mean by that is the collaborative decision-making process that really considers the child's development, her needs, any family priorities, and the practices we know work in promoting specific outcomes toward identified goals. What's useful about this chapter is that it provides evidence about the why of inclusion, information that those unsure about inclusion really might appreciate. Chapter 4 follows the beginning section the beginning of Section 2 in our critical considerations for inclusion. With the foundational knowledge of inclusion, leaders and practitioners can begin to think about how to prepare for preschool inclusion. So a great first step is taking a look at the quality of the program. Is it developmentally appropriate? Is it licensed? Is it NAEYC accredited? Are professionals using practices that are supported by research, such as the DEC recommended practices? And how are staff and families involved in developing and maintaining that high-quality preschool environment? We take a closer look at program requirements for early care and learning programs in Chapter 5, and there are several pages of resources that are noted here according to program. And then in Chapter 6, we present a systematic plan leaders can use to build support for inclusion. So this chapter includes a timeline for this work, and that is because change in learning does not happen overnight. It takes time. Finally, in Chapter 7, we list potential barriers and strategies that might help you anticipate or overcome them. Tools to guide your learning are embedded within each chapter and can be identified by the following elements. So there's tables, figures, forms, resource corners, activity corners, quick tips for your information sections, and vignettes. Instructors can use these elements to encourage reflection, exploration, discussion in coursework or in professional development events. Leaders can do the same to encourage individual practitioner reflection or to facilitate team reflection and activities. And administrators can also find these features helpful in just reviewing resources and supports in the field and the larger community. Further enhancing the content are vignettes that illustrate the complexities in facilitating inclusion in a program or community setting. So these vignettes are unique to the concepts and issues presented in each chapter. So in today's webinar, we used one of the vignettes in Chapter 1 to reinforce our understanding of the 3 features of inclusion. So that's something that I tried to model for you all that you might find useful in your work with professionals. Whether you follow the book sequence or choose specific activities, take note of some critical first steps you can take or you can encourage your practitioners to take to promote preschool inclusion as you learn. Keeping yourself informed about inclusion and developments in the field related to inclusion, such as recent research or new policies, is a great first step. There are a number of resources noted in Section 1 of the book that will help you stay on top of these developments. Sharing what you learn with others, whether it's foundational, advanced, or simply interesting, is a good way to start a conversation. And these continued conversations will help you stay looped into any challenges or resistance that may arise. Building a safe space where those less familiar with inclusion feel comfortable asking questions is an important piece of this. Finally, remember that any new change in learning takes time, as I mentioned earlier. So be patient, allow for this time, and learn with those around you. Preschool inclusion is no small task, but an important one that you can be a part of leading. So at the beginning of this webinar, I asked you to identify your primary role. Whether in that role or in any other role, you can be an agent and leader of change and an advocate for preschool inclusion. Challenges are bound to arise, and at times you may feel uncomfortable. I know that I have in prior efforts to also initiate inclusion. So choose to look at that discomfort as a starting point to learn more, to try something new. I'll leave you with my favorite quote, a statement by Eleanor Roosevelt. You gain strength, courage, and confidence by every experience in which you really stop to look fear in the face. Do the thing you think you cannot do. So before we conclude, and we'll have some time for questions as well, let's just take a moment to reflect on what you feel you cannot do or do not know just yet. And what I'd like you to do is think for 1 minute about how you can turn that into an action step about what you will and can do to promote preschool inclusion following this webinar. So it can just be a phrase, it can be a sentence, whatever you choose. But really what I'd like you to do is just be thoughtful and record your action step in the chat room. So I will stop talking now, and I will wait for 1 minute so that you all have a chance to think, and then I'll bring us back after that minute. So I'll leave about another 30 seconds. Although we're not on this isn't necessarily a timed activity. Okay, just a few more moments, and then I'll bring us all back. So I'm going to read aloud just a few action steps that our participants have noted. Please feel free to add more if you continue to think about ones you'd like to take on. See if I can find them here. So several folks have talked about sharing information in the book and sharing what they've learned today with their colleagues, specifically with staff, with therapists, specialists. I also see some action steps related to developing partnerships with the community, child care providers, and supporting their needs. And that's really a critical one because the collaborative piece is really important. Continuing to educate staff, sharing information with others, seeking out effective strategies for individual students with disabilities who are already included in regular classrooms. That's fantastic. And the book actually includes quite a few resources, and actually the following webinars in this series will address some of those individualized practices as well. So that should be really useful to you all. Continuing to provide concrete and supportive ways to help providers in the state feel comfortable and confident to work with children of all abilities. Yes, addressing that confidence is really important, and providing opportunities to build those skills is also important through professional development efforts. And sharing that information with itinerant teachers in the community of practice. Fantastic. So I am so glad that you all joined us today. As Barb Gruber mentioned, you should receive a link to an evaluation for this webinar soon, and I hope you'll take a moment to fill it out so that I can hear your feedback on how to improve future presentations. For those of you who are interested in seeing the activity sequence, and that might meet some of your needs around promoting inclusion and developing a shared understanding around inclusion, I'm happy to share that with you, so please email me and just remind me that you participated in this webinar, and I'm happy to send that to you. So I thank you all for participating and wish you well in your inclusion efforts. If there are any questions, I'm happy to take them now, although I don't know how to open the floor.
Let's just have people type into the chat box rather than opening up the lines. I think that will work better. They've done a great job of using the chat box, and you, Sari, have done a fine job of waiting, giving some response time. Yeah.
That was the first thing I learned in my very first student teaching experience 15, 16 years ago.
Well, you are applying it. Yeah, you're applying it well today.
Thank you.
So we do have some time. So if anyone has a question, you can just go ahead and type it into the box.
And feel free to ask questions about, if you have the book in front of you, if you have specific questions about the book, how to use it, or just general questions about inclusion and experiences, I'm happy to just talk about those as well.
Maybe while we're waiting, I could just remind folks that this is the first of 5 in the series, and they're every Monday, starting again next Monday, November 3rd, and we have Eileen Schwartz is going to be talking about her book with Susan Sandall, Building Blocks for Teaching Preschoolers with Special Needs. And then on the 10th, for any of you who have students with challenging behavior, we have Prevent, Teach, Reinforce for Young Children, the Early Childhood Model of Individualized Positive Behavior Support with Kelly Wilson and Janice Lee. And then on the 17th, Anne-Marie Richardson, Making Preschool Inclusion Work, Strategies for Supporting Children, Teachers, and Programs. So that they are in a pretty good sequence here, I think. And then the last one on November 24th is Kara's Kit for Toddlers, Creating Adaptations for Routines and Activities with Suzanne Milboard. So it's quite a nice lineup.
It looks like we have questions here. Where can the book be purchased? Through Brooks Publishing Company. There should be, if you do a search for First Steps to Preschool Inclusion, it should come up as one of the first options in Google, and it should take you directly to the Brooks site where it can be purchased.
And also, by registering today, you will get a copy of the book if you have not received it yet. Those are being processed, and you should have the book shortly.
Terrific. Okay,
Sorry,
we have another.
Do you see that question?
I do. Let's see. I'm going to read it out loud for everyone in case you can't see the screen. Sorry, do you have any thoughts about using itinerant teachers to support inclusion in pre-K and other preschool programs as opposing to having to build the building-based special educators provide the support? You know, I don't see why you couldn't. I hope I'm understanding the question. So rather than relying on staff within the specific setting or site, can you pull and engage other teachers, itinerant teachers, to support inclusion? And my response would be yes. So if I'm thinking about that question the right way, I would say yes. I think that one of the things that we talk about, Megan Vinn is actually the author on that chapter and really focuses on collaboration. You can build an inclusion kind of leadership team or kind of a focus group that really works on inclusion, and including a representative such as an itinerant teacher to kind of get their perspective about where they need support or how they can kind of see it going, I think is a really great idea, because we're really relying on a number of folks who are participating on the IEP team and delivering services to keep, kind of maintain inclusion within a specific setting or across settings, and so I hope that answers your question. But I would welcome anyone who's really interested in supporting inclusion. I'm trying to read our name of our participant, Marnie. I hope I answered your question, did I?
And then there's another one from Tanya Wright.
Okay. Well, Tanya is one of our colleagues here at CTE, so it's really great to have you call. Do you have suggestions for getting buy-in? It's one thing to want to be an inclusive program, but you have to have the support of staff and parents, including the parents of typically developing children. Tanya, that is the million-dollar question I think that everyone is facing. That's one of the reasons why we focused on administrators and leaders with this book, and that's why it's our primary audience. I think when we start with them and we can kind of build that overall support structure that we need for teachers to feel confident and successful, and also for teachers to feel like they can really engage and talk with parents about inclusion. So one of the things that we try to do as a team is really focus our professional development efforts with administrators, directors of preschool programs, and there seems to be additional efforts kind of within the field to include elementary school principals in those trainings as well, because early childhood is different than K through 12. So the more education we can kind of get, and that's one of the reasons why I focused on the preschool inclusion policies and the inclusion position statement. When we kind of have that, we begin with that orientation, then we can kind of use that as a framework to start to describe what it is we need in place to be able to support staff and parents. Did I answer your question, Tanya? Another way, actually, I just I just thought of this, and this is something that we used to do when I used to teach, was we used to engage in a school exchange program. So I used to be the chair of the professional development committee at a school, an independent inclusive preschool that I worked at in D.C., and we coordinated visits with other successful inclusive programs so that we could see what inclusion looks like. And so when administrators and teachers who were kind of hesitant to include children with disabilities in their classrooms saw how it worked, they were more likely to kind of want to learn more. So that was really an effective strategy in getting that buy-in or building that buy-in. We have another question. I am finding that some of our parents are being discouraged from keeping their special needs students in our program. These families are being encouraged by the IEP providers to move the children to separate classrooms specific to, I'll just scroll down here, to special needs preschoolers. Is this a recent push in the area of early childhood or specific to local education systems? That is also a great question. So I am also hearing and seeing the same kind of, I don't even know what we call it right now, but the same kind of movement. I'm not, I don't know that I can answer that question exactly. I can speak from experience of where I was seeing it. In one of the counties that I used to work in, many of the parents were very educated, and they felt that specialized services in separate settings were the way to go. They felt like that was the best way to ensure that their children were making gains. And so in that instance, they really rallied hard to make sure their children were placed in separate classrooms, and with their IEP teams, they made that decision. So yes, to answer your question, it seems like there may be a push in some local areas to do that. I think the way to maybe continue to educate folks is to kind of review what we've talked about today and what our overall aims for early childhood are, understanding that children make individual gains in varying ways within those first few years, and that they really learn from one another. So those individual differences are really a benefit to children with and without disabilities. So it's a constant, it seems to kind of be this constant need for education, and that's why those continued conversations are really critical. At least to me, that's what my perspective is.
Well, I think, sorry, you've talked about what the research is telling us, and I think the move is towards the inclusive placements. Yes?
It is. I think it does vary in certain locations. In one specific county that I'm thinking of, but I won't name their names, they actually, there is a push for separate classrooms. And so what professional development providers at the local and district levels are finding are that they have to do a lot of education, re-education around inclusion, and reminding folks about those benefits that you just talked about from a research standpoint. So I see in one more comment here. This is from Tanya. Having the background information in the book is wonderfully helpful, and yes, you answered my question. Great. Sometimes, not always, early childhood providers may not have college degrees. I wonder if some parents feel that specialized programs have better trained teachers. I could see that perspective, and I think that is that makes a great case for why we need to provide that continual, ongoing support in the form of coaching and mentoring. Whether or not whether or not providers have specific degrees, we can still provide them with education, and many of you are professional development providers, so I suspect that as questions arise, you can really provide them with targeted professional development so that they can learn how to individualize instruction, and maybe some education to parents about how they continually educate teachers is a good way to kind of continue getting that buy-in. So we have a comment from Levon Taylor from Forest Hill Nature Preschool. In response to getting buy-in from parents, I find that my parents are generally supportive. That's great. We approach inclusion as an opportunity for children to engage with a wide range of peers. Children learn compassion, and they do naturally become supportive of their special needs. Parents appreciate the opportunity for their children to learn kindness in this setting. That's wonderful. You know, maybe we should come visit your classroom so that we can show folks that it's really working. That's wonderful to hear. Thank you for sharing that.
And it's 4 o'clock, and that is a great way to end with that little entry by Levon. I just want to I want to thank you, Sari, for a great session. You got people going there at the end. And so thank you, audience, for your participation. I'll be following up later today or first thing tomorrow. You'll get the PowerPoint presentation, a certificate of attendance, the recording link for the session, and Sari's evaluation link that she wants to send. And then also, as I said, the books are being processed out by Brooks. So I hope that we see you all online next Monday for the Building Blocks for Teaching Preschoolers with Special Needs by Eileen Schwartz. And are you okay? Sorry, any closing thoughts?
No, thank you. Thank you so much for facilitating this. This was a great experience. I really appreciate it.
That's right. You've got your webinar under your belt now.
There you go.
Right. All right. Thank you all. Have a great rest of the day.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.